Hi, my name is Sana Razai. I live in Fresno, California, and in May of 2018, I had the privilege of attending the 110th United States Baha'i National Convention as a delegate from Central California. And in preparing my delegate report for the various communities in my unit, I put together a PowerPoint with a number of slides, and this is a recording of that PowerPoint for whoever would find it useful. So the purpose of National Convention is twofold. It's to elect the National Spiritual Assembly, who make up the electorate for the Universal House of Justice every 5 years, which is a very special link between the body of believers and the Universal House of Justice. And the second purpose is to consult on the progress of the cause throughout the nation. So in this way, every Baha'i from the grassroots level has a connection with both the national institutions and the House of Justice. And this is a very special and unique aspect of the political system of the faith. The convention itself was filled with prayers, and there was a constant devotional spirit that permeated the atmosphere. Also, the convention began with the commemoration of the Declaration of the Bab, which was May 24th this year. And this helped launch the convention on a strong spiritual foundation. And here we are in that house of worship, commemorating the Declaration of the Bab. The National Convention agenda mirrored the agenda at the International Convention. So in 2018, there was an international convention that was held during the Resvan period, late April. And so every 5 years, the National Convention is held not during Resvan, but during the end of May. So this was one of those years. And so I'll present a bit about each of the agenda topics. There's around 5 or so major topics I'll present about. The first is the Institute. The second is the movement of clusters. The third is enhancing institutional capacity. The fourth is involvement in society. And the fifth topic is that of the fund. And there was guidance from the Resvan 2018 message and other guidance from the House of Justice, which framed each of these topics that the delegates read beforehand and read at the beginning of each of these sessions. So the first topic is regarding the Institute process. So many times people ask the question, are we growing? And this was a question that delegates asked as well. And the answer is yes, we are growing. And it depends on how you measure growth. So here we see these graphs, and we see that there was over 7,600 Bruhi Institute courses that were completed over the last year from October 2016 to October 2017. And around 1,500 of them were Book 1 completions. That's a strong foundation to the system of education that we're developing. There are, as you see in the bottom graph, there are around 6,500 core activities, which is a strong number. And a healthy half of these are devotionals, and the other half are the educational core activities. And these activities engage 40,000 people, more than a third of which are not Baha'is. But they're being brought closer and closer in contact with the Word of God and with the transforming potency of the revelation. And so this is a healthy growth. The purpose of the Institute process is to allow systematic access to the Word of God in an environment conducive to empowerment, so that each individual becomes a protagonist of their own development, spiritual, social, and intellectual development. And the educational process of the Institute builds capacity to carry out acts of service that are fundamental to a vibrant community life, such as praying together, or teaching our children together, visiting each other's homes together, and studying together. These are some acts of service that are part of the first 3 books, for instance. And at this stage in its development, the Institute is naturally focused on receptive groups. And there are 2 naturally occurring receptive groups of people that we are exploring. We are exploring in North America, and one of these groups is youth and junior youth, and another one of these groups are populations that are living in dense neighborhoods or centers of intense activity. Just to give perspective on the United States, every year that passes, the US demographics become younger and more urban. So even just a few decades ago, the US was about 50% rural and 50% urban. And before that point, it was even more rural. Now, at this point, the US population is 80% urban, and the median age is 45, which was lower than it was decades ago, and 25% of the population is under the age of 18. So if the purpose of the Institute is to help systematically bring the Word of God to the masses of humanity, and so if we want to bring the Word of God to the masses of humanity, then focusing on neighborhoods and working with young people is a sure strategy for the Institute. And just a few other points about the Institute. We know that the underlying solution to any problem we see has an educational element to it. Any issue, racism, issues within the Baha'i community and within the wider community. So racism is one issue. Not enough fund contributions, that's another issue maybe people bring up within the Baha'i community. Poor health is an issue we see in our general community. Disunity is something we see in many communities. Lack of growth, social injustice, prejudices of various sorts, and so on. And the educational element that is a part of the solution to these problems begins with the revelation of Baha'u'llah, which not only sheds creative light on the problems of today, but inspires a motivation to then act. This is the potentiality of the Institute. It allows access to the Word of God in a profound and systematic way that is around certain acts of service. And just one more point about the Institute that that the delegates studied early on is that fundamentally the Institute process is an ongoing, ever-expanding conversation, a conversation that begins with the Word of God, that touches on profound subjects, draws out insights from experience, and this conversation manifests itself in both individual and collective action. And this is a conversation that invites participation of others, a conversation that all of humanity yearns for right now. And if we just take a few of the Institute courses, the conversation begins about with the spiritual nature of a human being, the journey of the soul, and what prayer is, that's conversation with God. And the conversation then progresses to aspects of the life of community, the importance of education of children, and the vast potentialities of junior youth, and the period of youth. And the conversation continues, if we look at Book 5, around the process of integration and disintegration, about our twofold moral purpose, about the transformation envisioned by Baha'u'llah that occurs both at the level of individual and the level of social structures. In Book 4, we see that this conversation takes us to remind us that all of humanity has a common spiritual legacy, and that's exemplified in the stories of the heroic age. And in Book 7, this conversation moves to the spiritual dynamics of walking a path of service with others, and in helping others walk this path of service, in accompanying others. We see that in Book 10. And in Book 8, we see that this conversation is grounded in the covenant of Baha'u'llah, this covenant that's not static, but it's dynamic, it's ever-changing. And so we can view the Institute as this systematic, ever-expanding, ongoing conversation that we can be having with our friends, with our neighbors, and that everyone wants to have this conversation. And so if we look at this stage in the history of our faith and the history of the divine plan, our ability and our efficacy to contributing to the progress of the plan depends on knowing these materials well. So the next topic was regarding the movement of clusters. As you may well know, and this is a map of the western half of the United States. I happen to be in California, in Central California, so I know that reality well. And just as background, so many of my comments are kind of based on my experiences from California. So as you know, the goal that the House of Justice has set is for there to be 5,000 clusters around the world with intensive programs of growth, or clusters that have surpassed the second milestone. The goal for the US, as the National Assembly recently mentioned, is around 630, and we've reached around 250, which leaves 380 left. So on this map, the dark green areas have some level of an intensive program of growth. Of course, every place needs to be strengthened, but the light green areas are have not. Those are clusters that are at the first milestone that have a few core activities or a nascent program of growth, and those are the goal areas. So just in the western half of the United States, there's a vast amount of places in which the clusters have yet to reach the goal. So it requires a tremendous amount of homegrown pioneering in order to meet this goal. And so at least in California, but across the nation as well. So the regional councils and the National Assembly have called for massive flow of homefront pioneers. And this is really reminiscent of the spirit of the 10-Year Crusade. The Baha'i world before and after the 10-Year Crusade was a completely different Baha'i community. It was a major turning point. And so here, in the remaining years of this current 5-year plan, we are going to experience a similar transformation. Imagine a time in a few years from now when all these light green areas will be intensive programs of growth, and all the dark green areas will be further intensive programs of growth. And so the delegates spent some time discussing the implications of this grand call for pioneering. And even the delegates acknowledged that the National Convention, the membership of it, and its conversations and its consultations and its makeup would be much different in 5 years or so. The nature of this pioneering is different than the 10-Year Crusade. During that time, the goal was either simply to arrive or to perhaps to start an assembly. And so the believers, because that was the goal, the believers knew well the methods and strategies to achieve that goal. Arriving at a place, for instance, might have required a lot of logistical arrangements at the time. Travel was more difficult, passport acquisition was difficult, work visas, etc. Or starting an assembly, that was the other goal. And so the believers who went there knew well the strategies to achieve that goal. Here, now, the goal is to establish an intensive program of growth. This takes a number of years. So the goals will not be able to be won in the last year of the plan. And so just like the Knights of Baha'u'llah, we, or those who are pioneering now in this plan, have to know well the methods and strategies for establishing an intensive program of growth. We all have to understand those methods and strategies. Otherwise, the goal will not be met. And so the purpose of pioneering is to help meet the goals of the House of Justice, which are the goals of the divine plan at this stage. So regarding the methods and capacities needed to help a cluster move from one stage of development to the next, we've been speaking more and more about a framework for action. The House of Justice has helped us understand all the elements of this framework. This framework is broad enough to accommodate many lines of action, yet consistent in its approaches. I think given the culture of America and the culture of the Baha'i community, we have a unique challenge. And this was mentioned at the National Convention. Our challenge in America is to foster diversity of growth. In doing so, we have to avoid two extremes. One of rigidity and the other of anything goes, and anything goes mentality. Or another two extremes, one of being passive and one of being haphazard and frenetic. And the example that was given is that there's a vast difference between a mob and an army. And there's a vast difference between a congregation and a movement. So here in America, we're hoping to create a movement and not just have a passive congregation. And we're hoping to systematize ourselves into an army that has a purpose and a direction, and not just be a collection of individuals like a mob. So this is a paragraph from the Rizwan 2018 message. So I'll go ahead and read this one. Cherished friends, This is truly a moment to give thanks to the best beloved. There are a great many reasons to be encouraged, yet we are only too aware of the scale of the task that remains. Fundamentally, as we have previously indicated, there must emerge in many hundreds of clusters a growing band of believers who can maintain, with those around them, a sustained focus on nurturing growth and building capacity, and who are distinguished by their ability and their discipline to reflect on action and learn from experience. Raising up and accompanying an expanding nucleus of individuals in each place, not just at the level of the cluster, but within neighborhoods and villages, is at once a formidable challenge and a critical need. But where this is occurring, the results speak for themselves. So just given that I'm from California, here we see California's map. And another strategy to help the movement of clusters from one stage of development to the next is to arrange the country or each region in terms of groupings of clusters. And in these groupings, clusters can learn from each other, and particularly the more advanced places can serve as a reservoir of both knowledge and experience and human resources, and as a reservoir to those adjoining them, those clusters that are not as yet advanced. And so here we see just in California that there are each of these different color sets represent different groupings of clusters. So right in the middle there, in the kind of the dark green, that's where I live. I live in Fresno, and surrounding Fresno are a group of adjoining clusters. And this grouping, all these clusters make up a grouping of clusters that can learn from each other over time. So one more point about the movement of clusters. And just to point out the number of core activities in California, it's around 1,500. Again, half of which we see that healthy half are devotionals and half are educational activities. And again, we see that healthy, over 1/3 are not Baha'is, and they are, and yet they are participating and drawing closer and closer to the revelation. So one more point about the movement of clusters. We've seen in the last few years, especially since the House of Justice has started to draw attention in the messages of 2010, 2013, 2015, the importance of working in a neighborhood center of intense activity. It's in these neighborhoods that the transformation of the revelation is keenly felt. In these neighborhoods that activities are able to be multiplied instead of just added. It is here in these neighborhoods in which learning is generated, and this learning is then able to move the entire cluster forward. So when we say movement of clusters, we also are primarily speaking in terms of neighborhoods as well. And just again, a little bit more about California. The goal is around 60 clusters, a little bit more than 60 clusters to have an intensive program of growth, which is almost all of the clusters in California. And around 30 or so are already at that stage of an intensive program of growth, yet some maybe need to be strengthened because they don't have a vibrant program of growth within a neighborhood. So they still need pioneers. And another 30 need pioneers just in order to be intensive. But at least the goal specifically in California is for pioneers to arise, to move into neighborhoods, to establish a program of growth within the neighborhood, which will then move the entire cluster. Okay, so the third topic is enhancing institutional capacity. Many delegates had comments about this particular topic, as almost all the delegates serve on assemblies or area teaching committees or regional councils, so on. And so there was a lot of personal experience about this particular topic. And I just had 2 points that I think are helpful to keep in mind. So the first is that the endeavors of the worldwide Baha'i community can be seen in terms of a number of interacting processes, such as the spiritual enrichment of the individual, the development of local and national communities, the maturation of institutions, and all of these processes trace their origins back to the time of Baha'u'llah himself. And these processes gathered strength during the time of Abdul-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, and under the guidance of the House of Justice, these same processes, have continued to advance. The scope of their influence has been extended, and new dimensions have been added to their operation. And all of these processes require structures to support them. Just like any organic system, think of a tree, the human body, anything organic, the purpose of structures is to support the processes. So the purpose of institutional structures, is not to manage, but to facilitate, to create environments in which learning can take place, to allow the grassroots to take ownership of the development of these processes. Um, Currently, our attention is being called to a number of processes that happen at the local or cluster or even neighborhood level. So just another paragraph from the Resvon 2018 message. This is particularly around institutions, so I'll read this one. We are reassured to see that the institutions of the faith are keeping this supreme need at the forefront of their thinking, devising effective mechanisms to enable the insights arising from progress to be widely applied. At the same time, greater experience is endowing national, regional, and local bodies alike with broader vision. They are becoming involved in all aspects of the community's development and are concerned with the well-being of people beyond its formal membership. Conscious of the profound implications the Institute process holds for the advancement of peoples, they are paying particular attention to how the Training Institute can be strengthened. They remain mindful of the need to maintain the community's focus on the requirements of the plan and call the ever-widening circle of friends to higher and higher levels of unity. They faithfully uphold their responsibility to refine their administrative and financial systems so that the work of expansion and consolidation can be properly supported. In all this, they are ultimately occupied with cultivating in the community those conditions that conduce to the release of powerful spiritual forces. It's beautiful the way the House of Justice describes the work of institutions, especially that last sentence, cultivating conditions that conduce to the release of powerful spiritual forces. So just thinking about the different processes that occur at the cluster level, the first process is the Institute process. You see that on the left-hand side. And this is primarily the movement of individuals through the educational system of the Institute. And for this process, the Institute structure is evolving. The structure of the Institute boards, coordinators, and their helpers and tutors. The second process on the right side there is the process of community building, the development of community life, or the movement of clusters and the movement of neighborhoods from one stage of growth to the next. And this is discernible through a rhythmic and cyclical advance in fundamental aspects of community life, such as teaching the faith, firesides, devotionals, home visits, feast, holy days, etc. These are all kind of outgrowths of individuals that are being put in contact with the Word of God through the Institute. And these are kind of the result, this development of community life. And for this process, there are other institutions that are developing, such as the Area Teaching Committee is one institutional structure that's looking after this process. The local spiritual assemblies and the auxiliary board members support both these movements in different ways, in various ways. And there's a lot of overlap between all four of these institutions that operate at the cluster level. So whenever we're consulting about enhancing our institutional capacity, the central question should be around the processes that these institutions support. How can we strengthen the process? So if we're on a local assembly and the local assembly is consulting about something, the question is, how do we strengthen the process? If we focus on the process, then the question of building institutional capacity will be more clear. And questions around the interaction of institutions will also become more clear. This was brought up multiple times during the National Convention about the interaction of these various different institutions. How do they all interact together? And I think it becomes a lot more clear when we focus on the processes that each of these institutional structures are supporting. Because in that way, these institutions become cemented together in common purpose. The second point I was going to mention with all this is that the House of Justice mentions, I'll quote from one of their letters, they mention an important characteristic of Baha'i administration. And the quote is, "Even as a living organism, it has coded within it the capacity to accommodate higher and higher degrees of complexity in terms of structures and processes, relationships and activities, as it evolves under the guidance of the Universal House of Justice. So earlier when I was speaking about the Institute, we were talking about Book 8 and how it deepens our connection with the covenant. In the Baha'i dispensation, the faith is living, it's organic, it's evolving. And the covenant implies change, even though, traditionally a covenant is like a rock, something that doesn't move. But in my understanding, in the Baha'i faith, the covenant is constantly changing. It implies change, and it's organic and evolving. And so our connection with the covenant implies somewhat of a comfort with change, a comfort with ambiguity. So seeing the evolution of institutions of the cause since the time of the Guardian to now is one practical example of how the faith is a living, evolving, changing organism. So it's okay if some of these, this drawing that I put up there is not meant to be anything authoritative. It's all kind of, we have to be a little comfortable with the ambiguity of how these different institutions interact, how they support the processes, because it's evolving and we're learning about it. So the fourth topic is regarding involvement in the life of society. So there was kind of three issues that the delegates spoke about. The first, and I'll kind of have just a little bit on each. The first is regarding social action. The second is public discourse. And the third is the issue of racism in America. So regarding the, at least from what I gathered from the comments of the delegates, the experience is still limited. So just a few things are mentioned regarding these. Regarding social action, there's been an increase in social action seminars. These are weekend seminars in which participants study the 2012 social action document prepared by the World Center, and then read some case studies around the world of how social action has emerged from the community building process. Just last year, for instance, 10 seminars were held with 380 participants from every region in the country. And so if we look at the total number of participants in the United States that have, it's a little bit over 1,000, have attended these social action seminars. And so a third of all these participants were just in last year. So there's been a real tremendous growth in the attendance of these seminars, which is intended to build consciousness around social action. It's not a call for action, it's to build consciousness. And just a few numbers about social action in the country. There's around 2,500 fixed duration social and economic development endeavors. And the fixed duration, so it could be a one-time tree planting activity. It could be, any of these kind of one-time or a short duration type thing. Many of these are actually arise from junior youth groups in the neighborhood, or from groups of people that have been inspired by a study circle or a different community building activity, and they arise to do something. 1,800 of those 2,500 include social action or discourse addressing race relations. So the predominant, the majority of them include addressing race relations. And so in these instances, animators and tutors and children's class teachers are learning to partner with local institutions, like the police and fire departments, schools, churches, etc., different community organizations, to address questions around race relations, especially within African American communities. So that's quite promising that there's so much kind of involvement in this area at the grassroots with young people, and so closely connected with community building efforts. And then there's 125 sustained endeavors in the United States. These are schools, radio stations, healthcare projects, agricultural projects, etc. And so this is all a threefold increase in the last year, which is amazing. So regarding the second thing, involvement in public discourse, one delegate mentioned that right now efforts around public discourse are focused kind of on three things. One is on Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity. These are seminars for undergraduates and graduate students to explore subjects especially relevant to students and young professionals and how to think about education and work through the lens of the revelation and through the framework of the plan. And this type of thinking can influence foundational decisions during someone's university years and help them deal with and combat the materialistic forces that are rampant in university culture. The second kind of line of action with discourse is the Association for Baha'i Studies, ABS conferences, which serve as a forum for interested people of all age and from every field to correlate Baha'i teachings with contemporary thought. And this can really influence how someone just interacts with their profession, with their colleagues on a day-to-day basis. They go to a conference once a year, they understand how their field and the writings of the faith are related, and then they go back to their field after they leave the conference, and for another year, they're interacting with their colleagues and they're doing their work with an enhanced understanding. In the third line of action with discourse is kind of the more formal endeavors of the Baha'i International Community and the Office of Public Discourse and the External Affairs Office that have traditionally been very active with the defense of the Baha'is in Iran, but are also now working on hosting a race amity conference that hopefully will happen in the next few years. Finally, this is Councillor Mark Sasson. He had a lot of illuminating comments during the convention. So finally, the third issue about involvement in society was around the issue of racial prejudice in the United States. And this was a theme present throughout the entire convention. The NSA has extensively commented on this issue in its recent letters and messages over the past few years. And while there was a few times when the tone of the convention became very tense and emotional regarding this theme, the majority of the comments by the delegates expressed an understanding that racial prejudice, like any of the deeply entrenched social ills of our culture, are not going to be solved through short-term, superficial action. And we know that the revelation of Baha'u'llah is destined to completely transform the inner life and the external character of humanity, transform hearts and minds and social structures. And so, as individuals are influenced by the revelation and as their hearts and minds are transformed, they begin to build new patterns of life consistent with the teachings of Baha'u'llah. And at the same time, new social structures will emerge that embody the principles of the faith. But this will take generations, and it'll require that masses of humanity have access to the ocean of Paul's revelation. And it will require that these masses of humanity have access to the revelation without any expectations or judgment on their part. And this is what the Institute process is trying to achieve, but it's still very early. The vast majority of humanity still does not have access to this ocean, or it still is not experiencing it in a conscious and profound way. And so this will require long-term learning on how to apply insights from revelation into action. And this is what the community building efforts are, as well as social action. And so just to look at the social ill of racism, it exists at the level of individual hearts and minds. It exists in unjust social structures that are an outcome of unjust historical circumstances. It's perpetrated by fractured community life or lack of community life. So we have to address all these different things in a coherent way. And we're not alone. The rest of the world is thinking about this social ill and doing stuff about it. So we have to be thoughtful with our approach and understand what the rest of the world already knows and what they're already trying to do, the assumptions underlying what they're doing and what they're saying, and not get caught up in it and support it or either ignore it or criticize it, but just connect the assumptions, connect these efforts with the assumptions from the revelation, because all of humanity is trying to build a new world. And one of the comments that actually Mr. Ken Bauer said was, it's one thing to stand up against injustice, which is what the world is doing. It's another thing to create a just society. Both have their place. You can't say one is more important than the other or better than the other. They both have their place, but the Baha'i community is doing the latter. we're not just standing up against injustice, we're trying to create a just society. And so we need to focus on the plans of the House, deepen our understanding of the framework for action, and not and at the same time, though, not criticize the efforts of the rest of the world in trying to stand up against injustice. So just I'll end by quoting a line from a message from the House of Justice from 2016. The House of Justice says, "The movement of your clusters to the farthest frontiers of learning will usher in the time anticipated by Shoghi Effendi at the start of your collective exertions, when the communities you build will directly combat and eventually eradicate the forces of corruption, of moral laxity, and of ingrained prejudice, eating away at the vitals of society." All right, on to the fund. So our lovely treasurer created a PowerPoint and presented it at National Convention. So I stole a bunch of her slides. So I'll go through these slides really quickly regarding the fund. So the National Fund goal was won, 36.5 million. It's incredible. 63% of contributors to the fund are individuals, 28% are institutions, and 9% are entities. And entities, there was a question one of the delegates asked. Entities are wholly owned by Baha'is. So a Baha'i is a small business. That small business is owned by either one Baha'i or a number of Baha'is, and then that business gives to the fund. That's what an entity is. There was kind of a few points that our treasurer focused on, and two of them were universal participation and regular giving. These are kind of the two main points. And so just a few stats. International fund participation increased 21% in the past 5 years. Continental fund participation increased 19% in the last 5 years. So this is really a lot of increase in participation. National fund participation increased 5%. And here are the number of individual contributors, unique persons who have contributed to the National Fund. 2018 was a record year of over 15,500 people. So that's about participation. Now about recurring contributors. So when someone is on a recurring contribution, some like an automatic online contribution system, they contribute twice as much over their lifetime, studies show, and they contribute for 5 years longer than if you just periodically give whenever you come to feast. And so here we see that the recurring contributions to the National Fund from an individual level have steadily increased. And so over 7.5 million, probably over 8.5 million, according to that graph, was given by recurring contributions from individuals. And we see the number of LSAs and groups have remained fairly consistent in the regular recurring contributions. Planned giving is another way of contributing, and this grew 72% over the last year. So I think a lot of people are more aware of it. There's a 25% increase in bequests and over 100% increase in charitable gift annuities, and over 150% increase in stocks and securities. And so we see these great statistics for planned giving. Contributions to the regional council have also been steadily increasing. We see a record year in 2018, over 1.25 million. So that's great. And one of the goals of the National Assembly is to have each regional council economically self-sufficient, meaning it doesn't require any funds from the national, but all the regional council's funds come from the Baha'is who live in that region that are directly given to the regional council. So the regional council right now gets 54% of its contributions from individuals and 50% from local assemblies. This was a really cool statistic. So the amount of giving to the National Fund through mobile giving has skyrocketed, almost doubled from 2017 to 2018. So they really emphasized online contributions and now mobile contributions. So 40% of the budget of the National Assembly goes to teaching and education, and this includes the regional councils. This includes the permanent schools. So all that we contribute is coming back to us. And there were other statistics about what the funds are used for, but of course, as we see the picture at the bottom, it's also used for properties, including the properties we already own, like the House of Worship and other properties around the United States. But also, the National Assembly recently has been purchasing many properties. Both those around the House of Worship, as well as just around the United States. And so that's what a lot of the budget is going to as well. And I think the NSA recently wrote about how the fund goal this year will be 38 million, next year will be 40 million, and the following year will be 43 million. So a lot of that is to support the teaching work and the purchase and maintenance of properties. Just some examples of the 40% goes to teaching and education. So I'm almost done with the presentation, but just a quick note about the who are the delegates. So that here's some pictures of some of the delegates. The last few years, the National Assembly has been collecting statistics about the delegates, and they're kind of nice to present. So this year, there were 35 first-time delegates. I'll start with the top left. 35 first-time delegates, which is the highest it's been for a while. It kind of hit a lull, and now it's been slowly increasing. Now we go to the top right. It shows the breakdown of delegates by race or ethnicity. And, naturally, many of the delegates are white, and many of them are Persian still. But there were 16% that are Black or African American, and an additional 12% that are multi-ethnic, half of which are identified as Black or African American as well. So altogether, it comes out to more than 1 in 5 delegates were Black or African American, and that their perspective enriched the consultations of the National Convention. So I think that particular race or ethnicity is well represented at the kind of in the national conversation of the Baha'i community. Bottom left, we see the age range. There was 18 people who were under the age of 40. Sorry, 40 and under. The vast majority are in this 10-year period of time between 60 and 70, and so that was the majority of the delegates. But there's a even spread across the other ages. And as far as a male and female, the number of men have been kind of slowly going down. The number of women have been slowly increasing, which is great. Soon it'll be 50-50, which kind of makes sense because that's the general population that's representative of the population of the United States and the world. This is me casting my vote. So the election process is carried out with great sanctity. It's similar. It's carried out with great sanctity. It's similar to the way that the election is done at the International Convention for the election of the Universal House of Justice. So there are instructions given, prayers are read, and once everyone is given ample time to write down their names, the names on the ballots, each delegate goes up one by one in alphabetical order, walks across the stage, drops in their ballot in a locked, clear box, as you see. The picture is taken of each delegate. After everyone has cast their ballot, there are 6 tellers. 2 this year have been tellers before. 4 of them were new tellers, and they're all delegates. They are escorted by security into a private room off the grounds of the House of Worship, and the room is locked. And then the 6 tellers inside that room, kind of in the privacy of that room and with a prayerful attitude, they count the ballots. And so it's kind of a cool process. This year, all 171 delegates voted, which is wonderful. 163 in person, 8 by mail. There were no invalid votes, which is wonderful. So there were a total of 1,539 votes. And here we have the National Spiritual Assembly for this current year. All the officers and members of the National Assembly have remained the same. I'll end with, here's the picture of all the delegates in front of the House of Worship. So I'll end with a message that the House of Justice wrote to the National Convention in response to the letter that the National Convention wrote to the House of Justice. And it's a really beautiful message, and I think it's applicable to not just the convention, but the entire American Baha'i community. I think it's here. It's on the next slide. This is the final slide. The message from your National Convention, suffused with an awareness of the spirit of sacrifice which both ignites and sustains systematic action, brought joy to our hearts. The advance in understanding and action of the community in response to the requirements of the 5-year plan, evident in the consultation of the delegates, bodes well for progress in the coming year. The earnest discussion on the issue of racial prejudice demonstrated maturity and signals an increased capacity of the community to learn to address this problem systematically through its endeavors for community building, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society. May the friends forge ahead wholeheartedly, and as they do so, they should be assured of our prayers at the sacred threshold, that their exertions may be met with bountiful confirmations. Thank you.